All right, it is January 17, 2025. Welcome to the Borderlines podcast. We are joined today by Christopher Worswick, who is the department chair and a full professor at the economics department at Carleton University. Chris recently spoke to the Standing Committee of Citizenship and Immigration on sort of the economic consequences of immigration to Canada. And a lot of people are asking questions about this lately. So thanks for coming on today, Chris.
My pleasure.
Now, the big question that I think people are asking, and sort of why this is coming up with immigration lawyers, consultants, and their clients, or foreign nationals in Canada themselves, is they're trying to understand whether or not they will be able to qualify for immigration this year. The Trudeau government recently, in November of last year, released its plan to cut permanent residence targets by around 20%, and also to that there would be about 1 to 2 million foreign nationals and international students in the country who would be expected to leave between 2025 and 2027, which is a substantial increase. Like I think the target for 2024, for example, was around 600 to 8, about 600,000. And this year it's supposed to be between 1 to 1.2 million and next year. So immigration lawyers, consultants, and immigrants are all asking, how likely is it that they will see this plan through the government? And I get asked this all the time. I'm sure Deanna gets asked this. I'm sure a lot of people are asked, is the government going to stick to the plan? And one of the questions that, we have to ponder in that, what are going to be the economic consequences of this plan? Will, if there's some, and what will be the economic consequences of the plan? And then how much of that would be actually attributed to the plan in the discourse? So I don't know where the easiest way to start. It's obviously a broad topic. But maybe if you could actually start by taking us through the two terms that sort of I think people will need to understand to follow this conversation, which is growth or shrinkage in GDP and growth or shrinkage in GDP per capita.
Sure. And that's really, I think, fundamental. I think a lot of the confusion is on that point. And when growth economists, macroeconomists think about models or mathematical or economic models of growth, that one of the first things they typically do is they divide the economy by the population. Because what you don't want is a situation where an economy just grows dramatically. But so GDP in this case, gross domestic product would grow dramatically, but GDP per capita falls. So another way to think about GDP per capita is its average living standards or average income per person. So in my research, I tend to focus on the GDP per capita, and I think academic economists tend to do that. Whereas people in the policy world and in the media, even the Bank of Canada tends to talk primarily about GDP. Increasingly, they've started talking about GDP per capita because what we've seen recently with this surge in immigration, both permanent and temporary to Canada, we've seen GDP going up. We haven't had a recession yet, which is normally thought of as two successive quarters of um, declines or negative growth in GDP. But we have seen sustained declines in GDP per capita. So I think understanding those two things and immigration can affect both in different ways. So you could have a situation in which, and I think that's what we've seen, is the population growing through immigration can raise GDP. In fact, you would expect it to do that because even if the immigrants did very poorly after they arrive, some of them will be working in maybe low wage jobs. This is like worst case scenario. Let's say they're working in low wage jobs. They're still contributing to the economy. Obviously, we would hope that they do much better than that, but if that's what happens, but once you divide by the population, immigrants contribute both to GDP and to the population, obviously. And so GDP per capita could well decline if the immigrants come in and have earnings below average. And I think that's what we've been seeing. Um, and I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of academic economists, like such as myself, have been raising kind of alarm bells over the last few years that we've seen this really unprecedented surge in my lifetime, anyways, of immigration to Canada. A lot of it through international students, to be fair, and I think a lot of it may not have been what the governments were planning, but it happened nonetheless. And so when you talk about increases in the number of people expected to leave Canada, it's really because this other increase happened, the surge in the temporary migration population. And so, the issue is what the government of Canada is asking is to, or planning to do, is to let these temporary visas expire. And they've not made it very easy, as you know, for these individuals to convert to permanent status. And I feel like that had to happen, given the huge run up. It is the right policy response for Canada to do that. But I think there's a valid question: will everyone leave?
Yeah. Is GDP measured by incomes or how much people spend? So, like, I was chatting with a friend about this, and they said, well, these international students are spending multiple times what domestic students spend on tuition. So, shouldn't that cause GDP to increase per capita a lot? To which I said I wasn't actually sure if it's measured in income or what someone spends.
So it is gross domestic product. I believe, I don't know the name of the equivalent term for expenditure, but I believe it should show up in there. So their tuition would show up and any labor market earnings should show up.
But that's separate
Um,
from gross domestic product.
no, I think that should be in gross domestic product.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So then if they are spending so much more, like wouldn't so that does show up, it's just still on the per capita, it's less than what the growth in incomes would have been.
I think that's right. It's a good question you've raised. I'd have to look into it in more detail to know for sure, but that's my intuition is it should show up
Yeah.
in GDP um, because it's going to capture all of the revenue generated from all production in Canada. So university ed or college education should show up as well.
Yeah. And so the people are going to leave. So I guess the first question that would result is presumably that will cause nominal GDP to decrease pretty much guaranteed just because there will be this many people leaving.
I think that's right. So we could well see a decline in well, we'd probably convert it into real terms, but nominal or real GDP should go down, I would have thought, because inflation's not that high right now, which would be the difference between the two. Um, but GDP per capita could go up. So it's a good, interesting point you raised about the tuition. I mean, I think the concern I would have longer term is it's true that the students contribute a lot towards tuition. And that's one of the reasons why I've always been in favor of international students. And I remain in favor of international students as in general. I think just the numbers that we took in were too high, right? And we
Mhm.
get into why that's the case. Then the question is, let's say the person's finished a 2-year college program or a 4-year university program. That tuition is only going to last while they're in school. And then they're going to get, if they go on to get an economic permanent residency position, what are their earnings going to be then? I think that's more indicative of sort of the long-term benefit that the country gets. Are they going to have relatively low wages? They may not, right? I mean, if they graduate from an engineering program at university, they might do better than average. If they graduate from a trades program, they might well do better than average.
Yeah. Well, that's what Mikhail Skudderud has said. And I think he's coming out with, or I think you might be working with him on the paper. He's supposed to have some paper that measures programs and economic success as
Right.
opposed to just a lump of like, a PhD from Carleton and a diploma from that now closed school that Minister Miller referenced that was above the day massage parlor in Surrey.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah, I think
I'm not on that paper, but I'm certainly aware of the issues. And I think increasingly, I think we have to stop thinking about university versus college. I think it really should be about what the person's earnings are going to be, right? Economists typically think of the value of, like, the labor market value of education is what would your salary be once you got in the labor market. And so
Mhm.
there may well be some university degrees where the jobs aren't great at the end of it, and there could well be, apprenticeship programs or college programs where the jobs are great. I think we should not prioritize university over college. I think we should say we want our economic immigrants to come in and be very successful, because then they pay lots of taxes, they contribute in lots of great ways to the economy. And I think the easiest and in my opinion, the least controversial way to do it is to think about it in terms of future earnings.
Mhm.
I think that for me, part of what has made this discourse so confusing is that there's not a lot of conversation about how it came to pass that this like hugely inflated number of international students was admitted. Like how aware are you, and I'd say this to both of you, of there being this kind of concerted economic study that, estimates as to what the outcome measurements were being, or was it just sort of the door was thrown wide open, the rules were set, and then it's almost as if the government is reacting as if this was a surprise to them, that this much influenced.
Sure. I think it's a few things. I think the federal government went all in on international migration of all kinds, right? So both economic immigrants, so permanent ones, both temporary foreign workers. And then when it came to international students, it seems like a win-win, right? Like you bring in international students, as already noted, they tend to pay very high fees, which helps the post-secondary institutions, and it helps the Canadian economy. And at the same time, I think the provinces were really struggling with funding post-secondary education. So the provinces were all in because this is a way to fund our institutions. The institutions themselves thought this is great.
Right.
We've certainly tried to attract more international students in my program in economics at Carleton. I think the problem is, and this is one of the things that we've tried to talk about in our research, is that, economists think about economies as having something called constant returns to scale, which is a fancy term for saying that if you double all the inputs into production, so think of it as capital and labor, if you just expand both at exactly the same, whether you double them or you raise them by 10%, then the economic output should go up by 10%. And I think that's generally true in a market economy. Where it gets more complicated is if you have a lot of regulation. So you say, okay, well, we're not going to make it very easy to build housing because of NIMBYism, or because we want people to live in small apartment buildings near downtown. Then you have a population growth, and but the housing stock should expand when you have population growth. You can play around at the margins, whether it's urban, suburban sprawl versus urban density, but we just didn't see housing growth to match the population growth. So when all these international students came in, the universities weren't building housing, but nobody was building housing to match that growth. And so I would say that our economy didn't exhibit constant returns to scale because we scaled up employment, broadly defined, if you think of international students as employed, but we didn't expand housing. And in my opinion, it was never very likely we were going to expand healthcare, because coming out of the COVID pandemic, our healthcare system was already reeling. So I think there were economists in the federal government. There are a lot of great economists in the federal government. I think they were raising alarm bells, but I think the federal government ignored it. And I actually blamed them more than the provinces because I think they had the in-house expertise. They should have realized what was happening.
Yeah, you and me both. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And then I think that um now, like, I think that there has been a lack of consideration for, okay, so now you've brought them in, they've made this investment, you did so on the promise of a long-term outcome that was going to justify this big spend, and now we're kind of aborting the experiment altogether.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would agree to some extent, but I'm not sure we really promised international students that they could stay, right? Like that's not how I read the program. So I think, but people are arguing that this is reneging on a promise. I'm just not sure I see that. I kind of feel like we let international students in, we're letting them finish their programs, and they may, you probably know the details more than I do, but they can stay a certain amount of time on a postgraduate work visa, but the pathway to permanence isn't there, and
I'd
that's
say
true.
there was mixed messaging for sure. I mean, the other component that I would add to what caused the growth, and this is something that I think will be explored and studied in the future, is most universities and colleges pay education agents commissions for students that they send to their schools. And in the past few years, there's been the development of online platforms that ensure that basically the maximum amount of commissions is paid out. So whereas before a school may have sent a specific educational agent to India, say, to attract students, now it's done kind of on bulk through certain online platforms that sort of, as far as I understand, ensured that every program was full so that every dollar would go out in the commissions. Um, and well, if we ever have Minister Sean Fraser, Marco Mendicino, or I guess to a lesser extent Mark Miller, although he's sort of been on the reversal, it is a question that I would love to ask, is whether it was deliberate or did it kind of just get away from them?
Mhm.
Well, I mean, I'm not a political scientist. I'm an economist, but it strikes me that, when you look at what's happened in Canada under the Liberals and under the US under the Biden administration, you wonder if governments are using immigration as a wedge issue, pursuing something that maybe they realize might not be optimal for the country, but might be optimal for the reelection chances. But then it just got too big. And
Yeah.
I think they
I think
probably didn't realize the housing effect, I think.
in
Housing,
2023, there was a press release when they expanded the Francophone program, which specifically said that the purpose of expanding that program was to grow the economy through population growth, which is sort of the counter argument to me saying that it got away from them. But just so going back to so GDP will presumably decline if this number of people leave, which as you look at that as and I know you're not an economist, but the political scientist would wonder then, okay, if that causes what is the definition of a recession, how likely is it that they abandon the plan, even if, you may think long term, it's good for the economy to get GDP per capita going again, headline recession numbers causing a bit of a political panic.
mean, it's possible. I don't think I've ever seen this situation before. So I think we're in kind of uncharted
Yeah.
territory in
I
terms
put
of
it into
how.
ChatGPT to ask, say, can you give examples of when a government has tried to reduce its population? And it went like, yeah, there was Rwanda, Myanmar, and I had to say, okay, outside of war. So the so GDP would go down. What I'm less clear on is will GDP like how likely is it that GDP per capita will go up or down as people leave? And what may determine that? Because that seems to be the one that would impact standard of living.
Right. So if the people, so if you think about temporary foreign workers, for example, right, international students, a little less clear because it comes down to whether they're working or not, and many of them are working. But if you think about temporary foreign workers in low wage jobs in Canada right now, if they hit the end of their visa and they leave, then that, I'm not saying it's going to have a massive effect at the national level, but they are kind of below average wage. And so if you're removing people uh, from an economy that's at the below average wage, everything else the same, that should tend to push the average up.
Is
And
that
so I think,
because companies will have to hire to, and unemployed Canadians will step in, or?
well, those jobs may not exist, right? If the economy is shrinking. I
Mm,
mean, but just the composition, right? So, you know, if the three of us, if I'm say the, I don't know, just for argument's sake, if I'm the lowest wage person of the three of us, if I leave the room, that's going to raise the average wage in the room. So it's just a composition argument. It's not a wage change argument. And
mm.
so I think that does matter for skill, right? So if, you know, if, for example, like if a country like Canada decided we're just going to take anyone from anywhere in the world, and we had a huge influx of very low skill workers who don't speak English, that's going to lower average skill, and that's going to make us a poorer country per capita, even if it raises GDP. In a sense, we're kind of unwinding that. It's not as as extreme as the example I gave, but as we unwind that, the opposite should happen. That
So
we're raising average by relatively low skill workers going back to other countries, we're going to have the remaining population should have a higher average skill and a higher average wage, is what I would expect.
now, one thing that people have said is the people who are Canada may seek the most may say, you know what, I don't want this uncertainty. I'm out of here.
Mhm.
And the people who are in those low wage positions may say, okay, we're prepared to hunker down, stay as visitors. And you sort of
Go
mentioned at the start, it's
underground. Yeah.
unclear, you know, if people will leave. Like, how much would that then, like, if that comes to pass, that would then seem to have the opposite effect, where it would be worse for GDP per capita.
It's possible. I think it's an interesting question whether people will leave. I've heard different opinions on it, and I don't think we've really seen this situation before. I wonder if it's harder to stay in Canada than it is to stay in a place like the US illegally, because we have a monopoly public healthcare system. It's pretty unclear how you're going to get healthcare in Canada if you're an illegal status person. So, and what I've also heard is a lot of the people who came as international students to pay these high fees, they were probably at least middle income in their home countries. And so, you know, like, would people stay in Canada in an illegal status, probably unable to take very good jobs, unable to access public health care, presumably for very long? And when they could go home and they might be living as a middle to high income person in their home country. I suspect people will leave. That's my guess, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, that's sort of the big question mark on the year. And I think StatsCan reported yesterday that net temporary resident populations in Ontario and Manitoba declined by like 1,000 each in Q3 2024. In order for the levels plan to be met, they're going to need that
Mhm.
to be multiple times greater than that. Um,
I
but
mean, I
that,
think, go ahead, sorry.
oh, but yeah, I mean, that just basically, it's the big question.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I've suggested is, like, we could, you know, given we're in this uncharted waters, we could consider maybe extending some of these visas, right, as a temporary measure to try to smooth this effect out. We're going to have this very large number of people. Some of them have graduated from great academic programs. They may not be able to become permanent residents right away. Rather than increase the number of permanent residents, one option we could consider would be to extend the postgraduate work permits for another year or two, so that even at the lower economic immigration levels we're planning, they now have like 2 or 3 years to apply rather than just one. And that might make it easier for them to, and that might be reasonable given, as you say, there was some mixed messaging.
Yeah, that's the approach I think Deanna was talking about, which is like, well, they're all here. What do you do with the people who are here versus kind of ensuring that this huge surge never happens again or
Yeah,
doesn't
like
happen again?
I'm very much you know, I feel very sort of my questions are always very basic because I don't understand how a plan that was put forward at some point as being something that is a viable plan, that this was going to meet Canada's economic needs, somehow is now the reason for our economic decline. Like I can't track how the or is it just simply that too much too fast? Whoops, we made a mistake and now we need to reverse it. And isn't there, I guess I'm concerned about the cautionary tale of now you try and just reverse. And isn't there also a possibility that simply backtracking, trying to hit rewind, could also have a significant economic consequence for Canada? Not to mention, like, it's like what will it do to our ability to actually attract those, like, unless we've sort of gone off the idea that we do need to be a destination country for certain immigrants, for certain students, that we want to be a center for scholarship. Like, haven't we kind of hurt our brand? Like, is there a way to do this in a more articulated way as opposed to just like, okay, sorry, no, time's up, you're out? Yeah, it's the randomness of it that I think is really troubling to me.
The randomness is unfortunate. But, I mean, my view on it is if you focus your, so let's talk about permanent immigration, and then talk about students afterwards. On permanent economic immigration, I would say focus on high skilled people. And in fact, in the paper that Mikhail Scruderud and Matt Doyle and I recently wrote, we suggested you should sort of start at the top of the skill distribution or the expected wage distribution, and then choose immigrants going down until you get to somewhere near the Canadian average. And then what you're doing is you're selecting people who are going to pull up average earnings in Canada if you've done this properly. That seems like a reasonable approach or something like it. It doesn't have to be exactly that, but focus on the higher skill group. But we didn't do that. We went well past that level. And also the other thing is there were groups pushing very hard for filling so-called labor shortages. Well, if the labor shortages are at the high end part of the wage distribution, then what I'm proposing would fill those because we'd be bringing in high wage workers. It's more like they're saying, well, there's these jobs that Canadians don't want to do. We can't fill them. And so increasingly, the government was shifting towards other motivations for economic immigration, whether it be to bring in, restaurant workers or hotel workers. But typically, those workers tend to pull the average skill level, average wages down. I don't think that's a good idea for economic reasons. So what we could do is just go back to that. I mean, traditionally, Canadian economic immigration through the point system and the comprehensive ranking system more recently has focused on high-skilled workers. So I would suggest we go back to that. I think on the numbers, on the levels plan, we're getting close to where we were 7 years ago. I still worry that we're going to get, focus on Francophone immigration outside of Quebec. I don't think that makes sense. Francophone immigration to Canada, sure, that makes, to Quebec, I should say, that makes sense. Francophone immigration outside Quebec, not clear that that's a great thing to pursue. Sorry, I talked about permanent immigration. Now, what does that mean for your international students or temporary foreign workers? I would apply a similar rule. Say, let's focus on filling high-skilled jobs. So the comment I usually get is, well, how do we fill these low-skilled jobs? Well, you let the wage rise until someone who's already in the economy wants to do the job. That's the standard way that vacancies in market economies are filled.
People who are only listening to the audio and not watching on YouTube would have missed me smile just now because I'm glad I didn't raise the francophone thing because I
And
feel
me
like I
too,
raise
yeah.
it
I was like, don't
every
get them
episode.
started. Yeah.
I mean, I've often wondered, like, what if you could almost, like, our economic immigration system right now involves visa officers reviewing reference letters to distinguish between administrative assistants who qualify as skilled and administrative clerks who don't. And if you could just replace that all with a system that just says, we noticed that you're a foreign worker and we saw your T4 and it's above X amount,
Yeah.
you're a permanent resident, and then all those visa officers can detect fraud or be employed or repositioned to be more in the fraud detection.
Well, I think that's right. And I mean, originally with the point system, so if you go back to roughly 1967, I mean, prior to that, we had a discriminatory immigration policy where, you know, if you weren't from the right countries and the right ethnic backgrounds, you weren't going to get in. And obviously, you know, for very good reasons, we moved away from that. And then the question is, well, how do you handle the fact that now anybody in the world could apply potentially? And the point system was really a way to choose in an objective way skilled or economic immigrants. And the focus has been primarily on skill, not so much on wages, but the way the points are allocated, both under the skilled worker point system and the comprehensive ranking system, they're clearly motivated by wage outcomes. You know, so we think we want highly educated people. Well, why? Because they're going to have higher wages. We want people who speak English or French. Why? Because they tend to integrate better and have better labor market outcomes. So we've been doing this. We don't tend to call it as starkly as I am, you know, selecting on wages or expected wages, but it's been a part of our tradition at least since the late 1960s.
British Columbia's nomination program explicitly ranks people on wage.
Okay.
And it's the most important factor. And it's in like,
Yeah.
I mean, the numbers differ, but like, you know, we basically need to get max points. I think it's 130 or 140,000 or more. And then like every 5 to 8,000 increment going down is less points.
And that makes sense to me. I mean, there's also this issue of what's the time horizon? Like, are we trying to find someone who hits the ground and has a full-time work in the first year? I mean, the work I've done with Mikhail Scooterud and Matt Doyle, we suggested, well, maybe you should be planning out, you know, give the economic immigrants like up to 10 years. Like, we don't have to do it based on earnings in the first year or two. We do expect economic immigrants in many cases to struggle to find a job that's appropriate to their wages or to their skill level, I should say. So you can be flexible on the time horizon, but I do think this is it's the easiest way to implement. I think it avoids a lot of discussion about what is a skill and how to quantify skill.
Yeah.
And it's attractive.
That's just it. Like, I think that this is part of what I struggle with. And I should say that like the focus of my practice is not on economic immigration, but I think that even when I'm looking at this from an economics perspective, what I feel that is missing for me is like some clear, cogent explanation as to why we've decided that this is the most desirable immigrant. Like, why is it that the highest earning, like English fluency, I understand, English or French fluency, I understand in the sense that that's a value of integration and being able to be part of the community. I get that. But is it actually, from your point of view, like you said, that this is clearly the right decision at an earlier point, and I keep going back to that in my mind, like, how for you is this like an absolutely clear decision that the right economic outcome for Canada is to be attracting those who will be the most high earning workers? Or does it not, could there not be an economic forecast that says that actually having this middle level that, you know, like, is it actually a foregone conclusion from an economic standpoint?
I mean, there is a debate about this. So, like in the US, a lot of people who are very pro-immigration, and I consider myself pro-immigration, but you know, sometimes what they'll say is, well, think about an economy at a point in time. If you can bring in, say, more immigrants and the people already in the US, if that leads their earnings to go up on average, then that seems like a good thing because the immigrants sort of in economics, we talk about revealed preference arguments. So the idea is if immigrants come to the US and are happy, even if they're at the bottom of the wage distribution, if they're better off than they would be had they stayed in their home country,
Yes, yeah,
then this seems like a good thing.
exactly. And
Now, in
also
our
it's creating the sense of cohesion in society that it's like,
right.
um, you know, um, that we're I think we keep talking about these Canadian values. I don't know what those are exactly myself, but the idea that we're like incorporating other ideologies in our own communities, like these sorts of values.
Well, I mean, I do think that, I see the value to multiculturalism and a diverse society, but just those things are hard to quantify in an
Of
economic
course.
framework. But like just getting back, just to finish the thought.
Sure.
So here's the problem with, there's two problems I think with the argument I just suggested that a lot of people will make. One is in a dynamic setting, like that works in a static setting at a one-off moment in time. But the next year, the immigrants that you admitted last year are now part of your population and they're likely to stay. So what could happen is you keep doing this year after year, and you could create an underclass or a large group of people who are very poor within your country. And that could make people probably like the three of us better off because our services would be cheaper and
Sure.
except the one exception is the tax transfer system can complicate it too, right? Because if you bring in a lot of low wage workers or low skill workers who earn low wages, they don't pay a lot of taxes. They may be eligible for a lot of benefits, and it might lead you to have higher tax rates to provide the services for the people you bring in. So it is complicated. I
It
mean,
is.
at a high level, what I would say, and there have been papers that have looked at this. John Cannon at the University of Wisconsin did a couple of really interesting papers. One was to say, well, what if we got rid of all borders in the world and we just let people move anywhere they want? And it's mathematical, it's simulation, it's an approximation. But what he argued was that per capita world GDP would go up quite a bit. But you can actually have per capita American GDP
Hmm.
go down is the problem. So is that a problem? Well, like as a liberal economist, the idea of borders is not very appealing. I think we should let people choose what they want. But where our position, Mikhail Scooter and Matt Doyle and I, our position was that the Canadian government isn't selling it that way. We've never seen a Canadian government say, we want to have immigration because we want to raise worldwide GDP per capita. Now, if someone wants to run on that, I won't necessarily vote for them, but I'll say you're right. This
Okay.
could happen, but you need every country to do it.
Yeah. No,
We'll
So
I
see
would
if
definitely vote
Mark
for
Carney
that
runs on
person.
that. In terms
yeah,
of like,
sorry.
let's shift to some answering some audience questions, which ties into what
Uh-huh.
we were just talking about, because by far the number one question that we got is to what extent is housing out of reach for me, or is my rent going up because of immigration? Is that, have there been studies on it? Is it just obvious because of supply and demand?
So I haven't done studies on this, but it's it it seems likely. So you get back to, our notions of economies. If the in a market economy without regulation, you would expect housing to expand with immigration or with population growth. What's concerning is that we've seen all this population growth and we didn't see anywhere near as high a growth in the housing stock. Uh, so it's hard to see whether that's causal or not, it's just problematic, right? It's hard to see how, if we don't see, we don't know, we think immigrants will work and be successful, but we know they need somewhere to live. And so if the housing stock doesn't grow more or less in proportion with the immigrants, then that's going to be, we're going to have demand growing faster than supply. The rents and the prices should go up.
Is there any reason why it wouldn't? Because I've heard some lawyers say that, we shouldn't be saying this is causing it until there's a study or something. And I always wonder, like, well, as you said, how could the population growth exceeding the increase in housing supply not cause housing and rents to increase? Like, what would be the argument for why that wouldn't cause it? And that it is just a correlation.
You would need to have, off the top of my head, I think you would need to have something else happening in the economy that's pushing it in the opposite direction, that you're not building into your statistical analysis. I suspect people will probably do research in the, either currently or in the near future, and they'll probably find that the population growth contributed to the increase in rents and housing prices. But it does take time and to collect the data, and it does take time to carry out the research.
Like, do you mean
Yeah.
something like supply chain issues that, COVID and the pass along effect of supply chain that prevented the one thing, and that it could be rectified with enough time, something like that. Is that what kind of thing you mean?
Yeah, something like that. Like I've seen people say, like housing experts who are not economists, I've seen them say, well, there was a huge increase in the supply of housing, say, I'm just making these numbers up, but say between 2000 and 2010, the supply increased, but prices didn't go down. But demand may have increased over that period as well. So you kind of have to, like, one of the issues is, for like the purchase price of detached houses, which is obviously a smallish part of the market, the fact that typically we have two income earners living in married couples now means that there's a lot more money that can be put into housing. And that's one of the reasons why housing has become expensive. So there's different reasons why rents and house prices are moving around. And what you want to do here is just disentangle the role that immigration or had, and that's not easy to do. But
Yeah.
I think if someone said to me, well, we're going to increase immigration and not increase the housing stock, that would be a red flag for me.
Yeah. Another question that we got involved fluctuations in unemployment rate. So in September, the government announced no LMIA, or they increased the threshold for labor market impact assessments for companies to hire workers, as well as I noted well, Stats Canada said population growth slowed in or Q3 or 4 2024. Net temporary residents shrank a little bit in Manitoba and Ontario. And during that time, the unemployment rate across Canada went down overall, like very small, 0.1%. But in British Columbia, for example, it went down around 1% in most areas. And so some people ask, to what extent would immigration play a role in that? Is it too soon to tell? Like, what causes these fluctuations in the unemployment rate?
Well, I'd have to think about it a bit more, but off the top of my head, I would say that, because Canada is so spread out, our cities are not that close together, with the exception of a few in the east. It's not that easy to respond. Like, it's not like people in Winnipeg are necessarily going to go to Vancouver just because there's, a change in the unemployment rate. The immigrants themselves are probably more responsive, I would say, to have not yet come. So if there were a large number of immigrants leaving one city relative to the other, or coming, that you could see how that would affect the local unemployment rate. I'm not sure if that gets at what you're asking, but that seems plausible.
Yeah. Well, should people be reading into like, oh, the unemployment rate just ticked down, therefore the immigration policy of shrinking population is a success? Or are there other variables, kind of like with housing?
Yeah, I mean, the unemployment rate is complicated because sometimes people just sort of give up looking for work, right? So if the unemployment rate's high, you can get this discouraged worker effect where people, because to show up as unemployed in like a StatCan survey, you have to say that you're actively seeking work. So sometimes people move in and out of the labor market. I mean, I think the unemployment rate's a factor, but I would also say what's going on with wages, what's going on with GDP per capita. Those things are probably at least as important in terms of driving average living standards. I mean, I've
Right.
talked a lot about GDP per capita, but I think the other thing you kind of want to worry about is like wage inequality or income inequality. I think that's where
Yeah.
unemployment probably comes in more. Like I wouldn't be in favor of a policy that says, let's just maximize GDP per capita if that led to a lot of increased income inequality. But I think if you focus on skilled immigration, it's probably going to raise um, GDP per capita, and it could well reduce wage inequality because you're bringing in supply of immigrants at the higher end of the wage distribution. But anyway, that's a
Can
different.
you expand on that? That went a little bit right over my head,
Yeah,
and I feel
so
like I missed a very interesting point.
yeah,
So,
sorry, I'm probably rushing.
the role of immigration, I maybe just expand on the role of immigration in wage inequality and
Sure.
how it can be used to either exacerbate or mitigate that.
Right. So let's say, just to keep it really simple, let's just assume there's two segments to the labor market, or three, if you like. Three might be easier. So you've got high wage workers, um, professional and high skilled trades workers, let's say. You've got a middle group, and then you've got sort of workers near the minimum wage. If you bring in a large number of low skilled workers, and that's sort of, in a sense, that's what's been happening in the US, right? Especially with illegal immigration. Large number of people who are coming in, and they're probably the only segment of the labor market they can access historically was this low wage group. So what you're doing at that third group, the low wage group, is you're expanding supply, but you're not really probably changing demand that much.
Hmm.
And so if supply expands, demand doesn't change, that would tend to push wages down. Now, if you're at the minimum wage already, maybe it's not going to change much, but that's where you could cause unemployment. But anyway, let's say it pushes those wages down. Alternative, consider a different policy, which is more like the Canadian historical approach, which is say we're just going to bring in people to be mainly in that top group, the high wage professional, high skilled group, however you want to call them. Then you're pushing out the supply of workers in that segment of the labor market, but you may not be changing demand very much. So now you're pulling the high wage workers' wages, if anything, down. So if you, it's just in a very simple economic argument that the low skilled immigration surge or increase, it's going to worsen wage outcomes for low wage Canadians, whereas the high skill stream is going to potentially worsen outcomes for the high wage Canadians. But the first one is going to pull average skill level down, and the second one's going to pull it up.
Mm.
So that's why I tend to think, just in general, a higher skilled wage focus is better in terms of GDP per capita, and it's probably better in terms of wage inequality.
Gotcha, gotcha.
Yeah, I think so. I understand that. I think part of my concern, though, is rather than looking at it just strictly from a data and metrics perspective, also, and I guess I know that they do some kind of like outcome measurements, but I do find that there can be a disconnect between what they're looking at from people coming in and then what, like, because the experience of those newcomers, whether or not they're actually going to be able to realize their projected income potential based on the field that they've been experienced in. And a lot of that comes from this notion that there's a greater value to Canadian work experience than there is to foreign work experience. And so there are other factors in that sense where, there's like a systematic kind of de-skilling of those who are coming in as well. So you might have high skill people working in a lower skilled position just because of, this idea that, they need to kind of prove themselves, to get the Canadian work experience, all of this sort of thing too. So I don't know how that would get factored
I mean,
into.
we talked about this, Deanna, a bit in our episode on caregivers, where you have nurses from
Yeah,
abroad who come in as caregivers, work as caregivers for 2 years, and then go be nurses. And it's
yes,
kind of like, well, should the immigration system be imposing this like
for sure. And then the
suppression
employer's
almost? Not that's not the right word,
expecting.
but like this compelling people to work in a different occupation, or just say, okay, just hire
And
them to be nurses.
and employers having these expectations. No, I want you to accommodate this schedule. No, I'll only pay you this much. And the only one who's going to be willing to accept those conditions is somebody who's hoping to earn, the right to stay and to be able to, to improve their standard of living. And so again, these are the factors that make it hard to look at it in a very cold statistical kind of metrics-based way, because the behaviors differ so much from what the intended outcomes are.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things, a few good points there. I think the first one you raised was, you could have a highly skilled person coming to Canada and their skills aren't recognized. So that's a problem. And there's two ways you can deal with it. One is you can try to fix the underlying discrimination or credential recognition problem. And those are different things. So I think Canada's made a decent amount of progress in terms of evaluating credentials. I think that's something that, in the last 25 years, a lot of effort's gone into that. And I think that's something we should continue to work on. On the discrimination, it's really tricky. I'm sure employers aren't going to raise their hand and say we're discriminating. So I think we need to work on that. But the approach that I've taken in my work with co-authors is to say, well, maybe we should just focus on immigrants who are not going to face these credential barriers. So instead of saying this, I'm going to take this, this physician from some country with a different education system than us, I'm going to take them because they're a physician. I'm going to say, well, they're probably going to work as, more like a pharmacist in Canada, realistically. And then I think it'd be completely fine to say, we'll admit that person based on the pharmacy salary we might be expecting. We don't need to hold them to work as a pharmacist, but we can use our data models and our metrics, as you say, to take into account expected earnings based on past performance of otherwise similar applicants and immigrants.
Right.
I think that's the right way to do it in the short term. And that's one of the reasons why I think the international students as a source of immigrants is so appealing, because they should not have the same credential recognition problems that more mature immigrants have coming to Canada, because they've graduated from Carleton University, they've graduated from a Canadian institution, and work experience is definitely an important one historically. And I think that's probably where some of the discrimination is people saying, well, your work experience in Africa isn't equivalent to Canadian work experience. And that's a very hard thing for a government to say so I think that's why we've kind of gravitated towards taking younger immigrants more at the post-secondary schooling level. I think the problem is we just took too many. It's not a bad idea. It's just how big should the program be?
Yeah. And I think that the danger that I see in, because I think, though I'm a lawyer, I think I have a very social science kind of outlook, is that the outcomes measurement can't be too short-sighted, because like you might look at the refugee population and be like, okay, well, this is a cost suck. Well, when you look at the children, the grandchildren of those, I find that they are some of the hardest working newcomers, they're often working 2-3 jobs, and it's sort of like, again, I feel like the data that you're getting depends very much on the metrics you're putting in. And, yeah, I would love to see some analysis too, in terms of like, looking at it as a diversity, and coming up with data modeling that sort of looks at all these different scenarios, rather than sticking with this proposition that the highest earners with the most similar education is going to be the most secure and safe. And I just worry that, as you say, that the discrimination part to me is that what's been happening in the discourse is so much vilification of the newcomer population, that I think that they're losing that kind of broad public support, and it's just reinforcing these negative opinions.
Well, I mean, I always try to make it clear that I'm talking about economic immigration. So I'm certainly not talking about refugees or family reunification. And I think those policies are different, right? The policy goal, like, we can talk about the cost maybe of, social programs or integration programs, but there's benefit there, right? We want to
Sure.
support people who are facing persecution around the world. So it's just a different model you would use. Whereas with economic, it's, you know, if you read the policies, this is supposed to be improving Canada's economy. And so the approach we took was to say, well, how do growth economists think about these things? Let's think about it in a similar way and then ask the question, what type of immigration program would make sense? And I think that, you know, in terms of how we select economic immigrants, it's kind of wide open, right? Like I'm not saying that we have to value, I always try to be really careful. I'm not saying you have to focus on university educated people. It should be what is the expected earnings. And so you could even do it by field of study, which is something we really haven't done. So, you know, you're probably going to get a similar number of points if you do I don't know, a film studies undergraduate degree as if you do, you know, engineering physics, which would probably have very different career trajectories,
Yeah, I'll
on
say.
Yeah, I
average.
think that I mean, trying to tell like you know, even those studies of what the dependent of a refugee will earn and integrate, I think if somebody is struggling to pay their rent, inflation is high, even if there are like studies that come out, it's kind of you run into the problem that former finance minister Chrystia Freeland ran into when she tried to say, well, the economy is doing great, which I think was based on GDP. It's the vibes that are off, and there's just a bit of a vibe session. And if somebody is struggling to pay rent and everything, they're not,
Yeah.
that type of stuff is going to land in a thud.
Yeah.
Just looking at the time, I think I have one
Sure.
final question, which is okay, keep your economist hat on
Okay.
and put on your unauthorized, but we'll ignore that for now, immigration lawyer hat.
Okay.
And there's someone speaking with you. They're working in Toronto. They're a foreign worker, and the unemployment rate in Toronto is 7.9% right now. Their employer will not be able to apply for an LMIA at the wage that they are at until that comes down to 6%. And they are asking, Chris, my work permit is expiring at the end of the year. Is the government going to stick to this plan? Will will the unemployment rate come down this year so that my employer can apply for that LMIA? What's going to happen?
You know, I'm not optimistic it's going to change. I think the current government um, is on a trajectory which says the person in that situation is not going to be able to stay unless there's something I don't know about the
Yeah.
situation. And I think, you know, I think if the new Trump administration goes through with tariffs, we could be in for a pretty rocky stretch. So I would not be very optimistic.
Yeah.
I would be
You sound exactly
sympathetic.
like an immigration lawyer, actually.
I would be sympathetic, but not optimistic.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly where we're all at right now. Can I ask, I hope that this is just a brief question, but I've always been curious about an economist perspective on temporary migration versus permanent migration. And I know that that could be a very large topic, but I just
Sure.
want a sort of a knee-jerk reaction as to how you feel about temporary migration as an idea in general.
I've done some work on it. There's not as much work on temporary migration as there is on permanent immigration in economics. I think it's problematic, temporary migration, if the work, so I'm thinking about temporary foreign workers at this point. So if the temporary foreign worker is tied to the employer, I think that creates all kinds of problems. I would not be opposed to a temporary foreign worker program with some kind of like numerical limit of some kind or target each year that allows the temporary foreign workers to switch employers. I think it's the tying them to the employer that creates the problems or the power imbalance, to use
Yeah.
non-economic terms.
Yeah.
And you know, earlier, I think one of you mentioned the live-in caregiver type situation. Like that's the same problem. Like, people are going into that program saying, well, they might be grossly overqualified for the work they're taking on, but they're trying to get permanent residency at the end. I think we should, I'm much more supportive of permanent immigration than temporary migration. And if we do temporary migration, it should still probably be fairly high skilled workers. That's my view. It can be useful to have a trial period, like very often, you know, my colleagues get hired as temporary foreign workers of some kind, you know, at the university level, and then they get tenure and they're made permanent. That kind of system has some appeal, but they should be able to go to another university if we don't treat them right.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think they're moving in the opposite way of
opposite
making it
direction.
easier for
More and
people to
more,
switch universities.
Yeah.
yeah, more and more restrictions, more and more limitations. Agreed.
And I
This
think
was
part of that
yeah.
go ahead, sorry.
No, no, I was just going to wrap it up. But if there's what were you going to say?
Well, I think that part of the problem is since, you know, about 2000 roughly, I mean, prior to that, there was very little support for temporary foreign workers in Canada. We supported immigration. We didn't support temporary foreign workers. And I think once the door was open to crack, expanding, you know, beyond the agricultural program, suddenly, you know, employer groups realized this could be a way to improve our profit margins. And so
Yeah,
it's become a big lobbying process. So we saw
yeah,
that under the Harper government. We've seen this under this current Trudeau government. And you know, that's I always try to push back to the extent I can on that thinking that it's, you know, that you need to let people leave jobs where they're not being treated very well. And that's as simple as I can say it.
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I feel like the demand driven model, it just is problematic in so many ways as I see it. Like, and the way that even the labor market impact assessment process, like show us that there is a labor, like the onus is on the employer to prove that there is a shortage, as opposed to looking at qualitative data. I find that whole process pretty laughable, to be frank.
Yeah, it's yeah, I mean, as we've talked, like it's, requiring companies to advertise jobs to
In
retain
ridiculous
existing
ways.
employees. Just
Yeah,
it doesn't seem like an effective use of anyone's time, especially job seekers.
yeah,
Chris, thank you for coming on. Parliament's prorogued, so I guess we won't see you testifying anytime until it's back, but we will see how your client, that person in Toronto, fares over the course of the year.
I
yeah.
wish the person well.
Yeah, thanks.
It's been nice chatting to both of you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes, you as
thank you.
well.